I'm going to start off by introducing my team. I'm Jessica McCutcheon, Director of Strategic Planning. To my right, we have Stephanie Gazzola, Research and Design Consultant. To her right, we have Daniel Robertson, Critical Analyst. And down at the end, we have Yana Kotrichova, Financial Advisor. This presentation will outline our proposed evaluation of the Olympic Torch Relay Initiative. The relay consisted of a 106-day journey in which selected Canadians had the opportunity to carry the Olympic flame. The flame started here in Victoria and went up through the territories and then came back down through the provinces to Vancouver. The relay route reached within an hour of up to 90% of the population and traveled through over 1,000 communities. The Olympic and Paralympic torch relays served as the centerpieces for the 2010 Winter Game outreach activities and facilitated Canadians' participation and engagement in the Games. Now I'm going to run through the program logic model for you so you can get an idea of the objectives of the initiative. So in terms of what's going into the program to make it happen, we have the inputs. Staff is needed to manage the various community events as well as venues to hold them and equipment. Also, the Canadian government and sponsors contributed funding to the OTR. In terms of the activities of the program, we have the Celebration and Commemoration Program, which awards grants to eligible recipients for celebrations of national interest. There's also the Torch Relay Youth Participation Initiative, which aims to encourage youth throughout Canada to participate in OTR events. Finally, there's the Olympic Torch Relay itself. The target population is the Canadian public, as well as not-for-profit organizations and educational institutions who may get funded by those first two programs I mentioned. The short-term outcomes resulting from the activities are an increased awareness of Canada and individual Canadians who have made important contributions to their community or country. The program also aims to increase exposure and audience for talented Canadian artists. This increased awareness should lead to increased community involvement across Canada as well as increased pride. Finally, the long-term goals of the program are to unite and connect all Canadians and to increase domestic tourism. The objectives of the proposed evaluation is to determine if the initiative was implemented as intended, to determine the extent to which the initiative achieved the intended outcomes, to determine the contribution the initiative made to achieving the goals of the Vancouver Olympic Games, and finally to assess whether the return in terms of the legacies established by the initiative was worth the investment. The proposed evaluation is a combination process and outcome formative evaluation, and that we will consider both the implementation and whether the objectives were met. Patton's utilization focus model will be employed in order for the findings of the evaluation to be usable for everyone involved. With this in mind, an evaluation steering committee will be created and will consist of representatives from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Vancouver Organizing Committee, as well as a few program officers, grant applicants, a number of community members, and representatives from minority groups. We will follow the Canadian Evaluation Society's guidelines for ethical conduct, including those related to competence, integrity, and accountability. I will now hand it over to Stephanie to go over the methodology.
As Jessica indicated, we will be conducting both a process and an outcome evaluation. The first three questions relate to the process evaluation, and the last three relate to the outcome evaluation. The first question, were diverse Canadian communities involved, will be assessed through the use of records reviews to ensure that the torch visited the intended communities and that minorities were involved in the activities, which should be available in the final report submitted. The community survey will assess minority involvement and youth involvement. This survey will sample communities that received funding using a stratified sampling strategy, and a random sample of the members of these communities will then be taken. The second question, was the application procedure implemented as intended, will be assessed based on the applications received and processed to determine the efficiency of the process. and how well the evaluation criteria was followed when making acceptance and rejection decisions. Perceptions of the process will be assessed from the point of view of the program officers, applicants who were granted funding, and those who were not granted funding. The third question, did the funded applicants use the funds appropriately? The suitability of fund use will be assessed on a review of the reports submitted by the funded organizations and the perceptions of the community through the community survey. The fourth question, has domestic tourism increased, will be assessed through the records from the Canadian tourism, which will be used to assess if revenue has increased by comparing the year after the Olympics to the 5 years prior to it. The community survey will also be used to assess the intent to travel domestically in the sampled communities. The fifth question, have community involvement and pride increased, will be assessed through the attendance at community events, for example, Canada Day celebrations, and the perceptions of the communities. The perceptions will be assessed through focus groups, and the Perceived Cohesion Scale by Bolin and Hoyle, published originally in 1990 and last validated in 2003, will be modified to assess perceived cohesion with other Canadians. A sample question from this scale is, I feel I am a member of the Canadian community. Finally, have awareness and artist exposure increased will be assessed through the perceptions of both the community members and the artists, as well as the records of relay viewership from television companies in comparison to other Olympic torch relays. We will also be assessing the return of the investment. Because it is difficult to put a dollar value on things like pride, awareness of Canada and our artist, and community involvement, we suggest establishing benchmark degrees of change in the measures for these indicators, which correspond to meaningful changes. Whether or not those benchmarks are achieved will form the basis for our conclusions on the value of the investment, and these benchmarks will be established in collaboration with our steering committee. The Vancouver Olympic Games used the Inukshuk as its symbol to represent the goals of hope, friendship, and brotherhood. This evaluation will assess the torch relay's contribution to these goals with the following evidence. The youth represent our hope for a bright future for Canada. Their involvement in the torch relay, as assessed through attendance, will indicate a contribution to this goal. Friendship is evidenced by becoming involved in one's community and interacting with one's neighbors. This will be assessed through the community involvement measures. Brotherhood between all Canadians will be assessed by the inclusion of diverse communities and the extent to which this program stimulates pride in Canada. I will now pass it over to Danny.
Inevitably, there will be some limitations to the methodologies we propose. However, we also have provided some justifications for why we've chosen these methods. First of all, with the records review, two limitations are that some of the records may be incomplete, and that it takes a considerable amount of time to go through all the records. However, this data has already been collected, so it's a little bit easier for us to access. Also, as part of due diligence, it's required that all organizations present data that is accurate, brief, and detailed, so we can trust the quality of the data, and that will cut down on time if it's brief. Also, it's good because it can serve as a comprehensive historical baseline that we can use. If we're looking at viewership or tourism rates, these are things that can be checked. And there's few biases about the information on things such as objective measures as such. Next, for survey method, some limitations arise, such as the fact that it's self-report and that item wording can bias the respondent. However, it is an inexpensive way, so it's most economical. And if we use validated measures, it can be a good way to get valid and reliable information. It can be easy to analyze the quantitative data, so that's a plus as well. And since we're dealing with a large demographic, all of Canada, geographically speaking, it's a good way to reach a large number of people. A focus group, although it can be difficult to analyze the data sometimes, and scheduling 6 to 8 people for such focus groups can prove to be a challenge, we found it the most appropriate because when those people are together, it's an efficient way to get data. The data is in-depth and can give us a range of responses, and that we can get a pulse of the community or the group that we're looking at by getting common perceptions among them. Lastly, key informant interviews. This, again, is kind of costly, as well as scheduling can be difficult because, if you remember, we proposed it with some of the artists. However, we found this was the best method to use because with a semi-structured interview format, the data can be flexible to get at the perceptions that we're looking for. We can get a good range of information from the artists, and the perceptions that we receive will be helpful in forming our conclusions. Some challenges that we've foreseen, some of the solutions that we propose, are the fact that this is something that has already been accomplished. It's happened already, so it's retrospective. So we can't go and use pre-post because that's not an option. However, in many cases, we found ways where pre-post may be possible, so we're going to apply that method. We cannot establish causality. It is non-experimental. However, we've used mixed methods, different methodologies, both qualitative and quantitative, to look at different aspects of the data. Diversity here is a bit of an issue because we're sampling from different communities, meaning that there's different activities going on, there's different languages, socioeconomic statuses. It really runs the gamut. However, a plus there is when we do sample from different communities, it's representative, so we can get a good idea of the different communities, what has happened, and look at that data. As far as language diversity, translation can be used when necessary. Another challenge that we feel that we may encounter is that some of the measures and metrics used might be unstandardized. That is, when we're talking about something as complex as identity, when we're looking at minorities, those who self-identify as such and such a group can be pretty difficult, and it's difficult to standardize when you're taking data of who attended what. So we will take that data in mind that there might be some inconsistencies and compare it to what we get from our survey data where we ask for self-identification to see if the measures line up. And this will hopefully solve that issue. So I will pass it now to Yana, who will discuss the dissemination plan, the budget, as well as the ethical considerations.